They tell you Dean Martin died of a broken heart. They tell you he never recovered from losing his son on that snowy mountainside in March 1987. They tell you the grief hollowed him out, turned him into a ghost who haunted his own mansion for 8 long years until Christmas Day 1995, when his body finally caught up with his soul. But what they don't tell you, what they couldn't tell you, is what Dean discovered 6 months after the funeral. What they don't mention is a manila envelope that arrived at his door one October evening in 1987. The envelope that contained a truth so devastating, so utterly soul-crushing, that it didn't just break Dean Martin. It shattered him into pieces so small that not even Frank Sinatra could put him back together. This isn't just a story about grief. This is a story about betrayal. This is a story about a father who learned that his son's death wasn't just a tragic accident. And this is a story about a secret so explosive that Dean Martin took it to his grave, choosing silence over justice, choosing dignity over vengeance, choosing to protect a memory rather than destroy a legacy. Because sometimes the worst kind of pain isn't losing someone you love. It's finding out that their death could have been prevented. And sometimes the heaviest burden a man can carry isn't grief. It's knowledge. This is the story of the night Dean Martin learned the truth. And this is the story of how that truth killed whatever was left of the man the world once called the King of Cool, the day the music died. March 21st, 1987. The date is burned into the consciousness of anyone who loved Dean Martin. It was the day Captain Dean Paul Martin, along with his weapons systems officer Captain Ramon Ortiz, took off from March Air Force Base in an F-4C Phantom jet. It was supposed to be routine, a simple training flight, departure procedures through the clouds, out toward the desert, and back home in time for dinner. But the weather had other plans. A freak snowstorm had descended on the San Bernardino Mountains like a white demon, turning the sky into a swirling chaos of snow and wind. Mount San Gorgonio, the highest peak in Southern California, disappeared behind a curtain of white. Visibility dropped to 0. The world became a featureless void where up and down lost all meaning. At 1:52 p.m., Dino's jet requested a left turn from air traffic control. The storm was blocking their path, and they needed to navigate around it. The controller approved. But somewhere in those next few minutes, in the confusion of the blinding snow and the disorienting clouds, something went catastrophically wrong. The jet didn't turn away from a mountain. It turned directly into it. At over 400 miles per hour, the F-4C Phantom slammed into the granite face of Mount San Gorgonio. The impact was instant. There would have been no time to realize what was happening, no time to be afraid, no time to say goodbye. One moment they were flying. The next moment, there was nothing but twisted metal and silence. Back in Beverly Hills, Dean Martin was watching television. He didn't know that his world had just ended. He didn't know that the telephone was about to ring with news that would bring him to his knees. He didn't know that the next 3 days would be a living hell of waiting, hoping, praying for a miracle that would never come. When the call finally came, when the voice on the other end said those terrible words, "Mr. Martin, your son's plane is missing," Dean Martin entered a darkness that no spotlight could ever illuminate again. For 3 days, the storm raged on. For 3 days, search teams couldn't reach the crash site. For 3 days, Dean sat in his living room, chain smoking, staring at the phone, clinging to the desperate hope that somehow, some way, his boy had survived, that Dino had ejected, that he was sitting on a mountainside, cold but alive, waiting for rescue. But when the weather finally broke, when the helicopters finally reached the wreckage, there was no survivor. There was no parachute. There was only the confirmation that Dean Paul Martin had died on impact. And that's when the first Dean Martin died. The man who collapsed in that chair. The man who couldn't even cry because the pain was too deep for tears. That man was already gone. What walked around after that was just a shell, going through the motions, trying to figure out how to keep breathing, when the only person who made breathing worthwhile was gone. The official story was clear: pilot error, spatial disorientation. The storm had confused Dino's instruments. In the chaos of the whiteout conditions, he had lost his bearings and flown straight into the mountain. It was a tragic accident, a terrible combination of bad weather and human limitation. These things happen. Nobody's fault. Just one of those heartbreaking realities of military aviation. Dean Martin accepted this explanation. What choice did he have? The Air Force had conducted their investigation. The experts had reviewed the evidence. The conclusion was final. His son had died serving his country, and while that knowledge didn't ease the pain, it at least gave the tragedy a framework of honor and sacrifice. But then came October, the envelope that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening, 6 months after the funeral. Dean was in his usual spot, sitting in his chair, watching an old Western on television. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock, every reminder that he was alone. The doorbell rang. Dean almost didn't answer it. He didn't want visitors. He didn't want company. He didn't want people looking at him with those pitying eyes, offering condolences that meant nothing, saying things like, "Time heals all wounds," when Dean knew damn well that some wounds never heal. They just bleed slower. But something made him get up. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the small part of him that still functioned on autopilot, still played the role of the polite host even when hosting was the last thing he wanted to do. He opened the door. There was no one there. But on the doorstep, propped against the wall, was a large manila envelope. No name, no return address. Just thick, heavy, and sealed with tape. Dean picked it up. He looked up and down the street, but whoever had delivered it was already gone. The neighborhood was empty, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights. He closed the door and carried the envelope to his study. For a long moment, he just looked at it. Something about it felt wrong. Something about the way it had been delivered, anonymously, secretly, felt like a warning. But curiosity, that most human of impulses, won out. Dean Martin, the man who had spent his whole life playing it cool, who had built a career on never seeming too interested in anything, found himself tearing open the envelope with hands that trembled. Inside were documents. Official-looking documents with Air Force letterheads and technical jargon that Dean didn't immediately understand. There were diagrams of flight patterns. There were transcripts of radio communications. There were photographs of the wreckage. And there was a letter, handwritten, anonymous. Dean read it once. Then he read it again. And then he read it a third time, because his brain simply couldn't process what he was seeing. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be real. But there it was, in black and white, in careful handwriting that suggested someone who had taken great pains to get every detail correct. The letter explained that the crash wasn't just pilot error. It wasn't just bad weather and bad luck. There was more to the story. There was a piece of the puzzle that the official investigation had either overlooked or deliberately ignored. The F-4C Phantom that Dino had been flying that day had a history. 3 months before the crash, that same aircraft had experienced a malfunction during a training exercise. A critical component in the navigation system had glitched, causing temporary instrument failure. The pilot on that flight had reported the issue. The plane had been inspected. The problem was supposedly fixed. But it wasn't fixed. Not really. The documents in the envelope showed maintenance records that had been signed off, certifications that had been approved, inspection reports that declared the aircraft airworthy. But according to the anonymous letter, those inspections had been rushed. Corners had been cut. Budget pressures and time constraints had led to a repair that looked good on paper but wasn't thorough enough. And on March 21st, 1987, in the middle of a snowstorm, when Captain Dean Paul Martin needed his instruments to be perfect, when he needed every piece of equipment to function flawlessly because his life depended on it, that navigation system failed again. The letter explained that Dino had requested a left turn to avoid the storm. But his instruments, compromised by the unresolved malfunction, were feeding him false information. In the disorienting chaos of the whiteout conditions, with instruments he thought he could trust but couldn't, he had turned not away from the mountain, but directly into it. The crash wasn't just pilot error. It was equipment failure. It was negligence. It was bureaucracy and budget cuts and someone, somewhere, signing a piece of paper saying that a plane was safe to fly when it wasn't. The letter ended with a single sentence that would haunt Dean Martin for the rest of his life. Your son didn't have to die that day. Someone failed him, and that someone is still walking free. Dean sat in his study until the sun came up. He didn't move. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He just sat there, surrounded by those documents, feeling a new kind of pain that he hadn't thought possible. The grief of losing Dino had been unbearable. But this was something worse. This was rage. This was a slow-burning, toxic realization that his son's death had been preventable. That somewhere in the chain of command, someone had been lazy or careless or more concerned with paperwork than with human lives. And that person had killed his boy just as surely as if they had pushed him off that mountain themselves. The investigation that nearly broke him. Dean Martin didn't know what to do with the information. He couldn't go to the police because this wasn't a criminal matter, not in any way that the law would recognize. Negligence in military maintenance procedures? That was an internal Air Force issue. And even if he wanted to pursue it, the anonymous nature of the documents meant he had no verified source, no official backing, no proof that would stand up to scrutiny. He couldn't go to the press. Dean had spent decades protecting his privacy, keeping his personal life out of the tabloids, maintaining the mystique of Dean Martin the entertainer while guarding Dean Crocetti the man. To go public with this would mean opening himself up to a media circus. It would mean congressional hearings and military investigations, and his son's death being picked apart by strangers. It would mean turning Dino's memory into a headline, a talking point, a political football. Dean couldn't do that to his boy, but he also couldn't do nothing. So he started his own investigation. Quietly, carefully, he hired a private investigator, a former military man who knew how to navigate the bureaucracy and ask questions without attracting attention. He paid the man well and told him to find out everything about that F-4C Phantom, about its maintenance history, about who signed off on those inspections, about whether the anonymous letter was telling the truth. For 3 months, Dean waited. For 3 months, he lived in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of life while inside he was screaming. He went to dinner at his favorite restaurants. He played golf with friends. He smiled and signed autographs and played the role of Dean Martin. But every moment, every single moment, he was thinking about that envelope. Finally, the investigator came back with his report. The anonymous letter was true. All of it. The F-4C Phantom had indeed experienced a malfunction 3 months before the crash. The navigation system had been flagged as problematic. The inspection that followed had been cursory at best. The maintenance officer who signed off on the repairs had been under pressure to clear the backlog of aircraft waiting for certification. He had taken the word of mechanics who said the problem was fixed without personally verifying it. He had prioritized paperwork over due diligence. Was it criminal? No. Was it negligent? Absolutely. But proving it would require access to records that Dean didn't have. It would require whistleblowers from inside the Air National Guard. It would require a level of public pressure and media attention that Dean simply wasn't willing to generate. The investigator had even managed to identify the maintenance officer. Dean looked at the photograph. It was a man in his 40s, a career military man with a family of his own. Not a monster, not some cartoon villain, just a guy who had made a mistake. A mistake that cost Dean Paul Martin his life. Dean Martin stared at that photograph for hours. He imagined confronting the man. He imagined walking up to him and asking him, "Do you know what you did? Do you know that my son is dead because you were in a hurry? Do you know that I wake up every morning and the first thing I think about is how he must have felt in those last seconds when his instruments were lying to him and the mountain was rushing toward him and there was nothing he could do?" But what would that accomplish? The man would apologize. Probably, he would say he was sorry, that he never meant for this to happen, that he had followed procedures as best he could, and maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe he genuinely thought the plane was safe. Maybe he had trusted his mechanics and his training in the system, and the system had failed. Confrontation wouldn't bring Dino back. It wouldn't undo March 21st, 1987. It wouldn't erase those 3 days of hell or the 6 months of grief or the knowledge that Dean now carried. So Dean made a decision. He decided to do nothing. Not because he didn't care, not because he had forgiven, but because he understood, in a way that only a man who has lost everything can understand, that vengeance is just another word for emptiness, that justice, even if he could achieve it, wouldn't heal the wound, that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever make this right. The burden of silence. Carrying a secret like this changes a man. It corrodes him from the inside out. It takes the grief, which is already unbearable, and adds layers of anger and frustration and helplessness that compound with every passing day. Dean Martin had always been a private person. He had always kept his emotions close to the chest, hidden behind that famous cool demeanor. But after October 1987, after he learned the truth about Dino's crash, that privacy became a prison. He couldn't talk about it. He couldn't share it. He couldn't even hint at it, because to do so would risk opening the floodgates. Frank Sinatra would have wanted to fight. Sammy Davis Jr. would have wanted to go public. Jerry Lewis would have wanted lawyers and investigations and congressional hearings. And Dean's ex-wife, Jean, Dino's mother, would have wanted blood. Dean couldn't put them through that. He couldn't put Dino's memory through that. So he carried the secret alone. There were moments when the burden almost crushed him. Late at night, when he couldn't sleep, when the house was too quiet and the memories were too loud, Dean would pour himself a drink and stare at that photograph of the maintenance officer. He would imagine picking up the phone. He would imagine calling the man, hearing his voice, saying the words that burned in his throat. But he never made the call. Because what would he say? You killed my son? The man probably already knew. Probably woke up some nights thinking about it. Probably carried his own burden of guilt. And if he didn't, if he had somehow rationalized away, convinced himself it wasn't his fault, then Dean's accusation would mean nothing anyway. The knowledge poisoned everything. Every memory of Dino became tinged with the awareness that it shouldn't have ended that way. Every photograph became a reminder not just of loss, but a preventable loss. Every tribute, every honor, every time someone called Dino a hero who died serving his country, Dean wanted to scream, he didn't die a hero. He died because someone didn't do their job. But he never screamed. He never said a word. He just smiled that sad, distant smile and said thank you and went home to his empty house and his empty chair and his secrets. The 1988 reunion tour with Frank and Sammy was torture for Dean, not just because he was grieving, but because now he was grieving with knowledge. When he stood on that stage in Oakland, in Chicago, in Vancouver, he wasn't just mourning his son. He was mourning the injustice of it. He was performing for audiences who saw tragedy but not the full picture, who sympathized with an accident but didn't know about the negligence. When Dean walked off that stage in Chicago, when he told Frank, I want to go home, he wasn't just walking away from the tour. He was walking away from the pretense that life could ever be normal again. He was walking away from the lie that time would heal this wound. He was walking away from a world that expected him to move on when he knew something that made moving on impossible. Frank was furious. He called Dean selfish. He said Dean was giving up, that he was dishonoring Dino's memory by retreating from life. But Frank didn't know. Nobody knew. And Dean couldn't explain without revealing the secret. So he took the criticism. He let Frank be angry. He let the world think he was just a broken old man who couldn't handle his grief. It was easier than the truth. The man who knew too much. The final 7 years of Dean Martin's life were defined by what he knew and what he couldn't say. He became a ghost not just because of grief, but because of secrets. He dined alone at his favorite restaurants, setting that empty place for Dino, but now those dinners had an added weight. He wasn't just remembering his son. He was talking to him, apologizing to him, explaining why he hadn't pursued justice. I couldn't do it, kid, he would whisper to the empty chair. I couldn't drag your name through the mud. I couldn't turn your death into a circus. You were better than that. You deserve better than that. Friends noticed a change. Dean had always been quiet, but now there was a quality to his silence that felt different, heavier, more deliberate. When conversation turned to Dino, Dean would nod and smile, but his eyes would go somewhere else, somewhere dark and far away. There were moments when he almost told someone, almost shared the burden. Jerry Lewis came to visit in 1991, tried to mend their decades-long feud. They talk about old times, about comedy, about life. And for a moment, Dean almost said it, almost pulled out that manila envelope, which he kept hidden in his study, and showed Jerry everything. But he stopped himself, because once the secret was out, it couldn't be taken back. And Dean had made his choice. He had chosen silence. He had chosen to protect Dino's memory over pursuing what happened. He had chosen, in his own way, peace over justice. It wasn't the kind of peace that brought comfort. It was the peace of resignation. The peace of a man who had decided that some fights can't be won and some truths do more harm than good. People often asked Dean during those final years if he had any regrets. He would always say no, but that was a lie. He had one massive regret that ate at him every single day. He regretted not being able to save his son, not just from the crash itself, which was beyond his control, but from a negligence that made the crash possible. In Dean's mind, he had failed Dino twice. Once by not being there on March 21st, 1987, and once by not demanding accountability afterward. The second failure haunted him almost as much as the first. The final secret. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995, the world mourned a legend. The obituaries talked about his music, his movies, his cool persona, his partnership with Jerry Lewis, his place in the Rat Pack. They talked about how he never recovered from losing his son, but they didn't know the whole story. They didn't know about the manila envelope hidden in his study. They didn't know about the investigation he had commissioned. They didn't know about the nights he spent staring at the photograph of a maintenance officer whose carelessness had cost Dean everything. Among Dean's personal effects, his family found the envelope. They read the documents. They read the anonymous letter. And they faced the same decision Dean had faced. What to do with this information? They chose the same path Dean had chosen. Silence. Not because they didn't care about justice, but because they understood what Dean had understood. That pursuing it would hurt more than it would help. That would turn Dino's death into a controversy rather than a tribute. That some truths, no matter how important, are better left unsaid. The manila envelope was quietly destroyed. The investigation report was filed away. The secret that Dean Martin had carried to his grave remained buried. Was this the right decision? That's not for anyone to judge. Each person processes grief differently. Each person weighs justice against peace in their own way. Dean Martin, a man who had spent his entire life in the spotlight, chose to keep his deepest pain private. He chose to carry that burden alone rather than share it with the world. Some might call that noble. Others might call it tragic. Dean Martin would probably have called it necessary. The legacy of silence, the story of Dean Martin's final years, is usually told as a simple tale of grief. A father who couldn't survive the loss of his son. And that's true as far as it goes. But it's not the complete truth. The complete truth is darker and more complex. It's the story of a man who didn't just grieve a death, but grieve an injustice. Who didn't just mourn a son, but mourn the preventable nature of that loss. Who didn't just suffer from sadness, but suffered from knowledge. Dean Martin died knowing that Dino didn't have to die. Died knowing that somewhere, someone had made a mistake that cost his boy's life. Died knowing that no one would ever be held accountable for that mistake. And died knowing that he, Dean Martin, had chosen not to fight for that accountability. That knowledge didn't make him weak. If anything, it made his final years a testament to a different kind of strength. The strength to choose dignity over vengeance. The strength to protect a memory over pursuing a reckoning. The strength to carry a secret that burned inside him because the alternative would have caused more pain. When people listen to That's a More Error, everybody loves somebody now. They're hearing the voice of a man who knew things they didn't, who smiled through pain they couldn't imagine, who entertained millions while carrying secrets that would have destroyed most people. And maybe that's the real legacy of Dean Martin. Not just the music or the movies or the cool persona, but the private courage of a man who chose to suffer in silence rather than turn his son's death into a spectacle. The night Dean Martin found out what really caused Dino Jr.'s crash, he didn't just learn about negligence or bureaucracy or systemic failure. He learned something deeper about himself. He learned that even in the face of the ultimate injustice, even when every instinct screamed for revenge, even when the truth begged be told, sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is choose silence. Not because the truth doesn't matter, but because some truths, once unleashed, create more victims than they avenge. Dean Martin took that truth to his grave. He carried it through 8 years of lonely dinners and sleepless nights and forced smiles. He carried it through the disappointment of friends who didn't understand why he had given up. He carried it through the pain of watching the world honor his son's sacrifice, while knowing it shouldn't have been a sacrifice at all. And in the end, when his emphysema-ravaged lungs finally gave out on Christmas Day 1995, Dean Martin's last thoughts were probably not of fame or fortune or legacy. They were probably of Dino, of his golden boy, of the son he had loved more than life itself. And maybe, just maybe, there was some small comfort in knowing that he had protected that son one last time. Not from death, which he couldn't prevent, but from the indignity of becoming a headline, a controversy, a cautionary tale. Dean Martin died the same way he lived, keeping his deepest feelings to himself, maintaining that cool exterior, playing a role everyone expected while hiding the truth underneath. The world thought they knew Dean Martin, but the real Dean Martin, the man who carried an unbearable secret for 8 years, the man who chose his son's dignity over his own need for justice, that man died alone with his truths intact. Rest in peace, Dino, and rest in peace, Dean. You both deserve so much better than what this world gave you. But at least, in the end, you had each other, the pilot and the father, reunited at last, far from the pain of negligence and bureaucracy and secrets that should never have needed to be kept. The king of cool is gone, but the story of what he knew and what he chose not to tell remains one of the most heartbreaking testaments to a father's love that Hollywood has ever known. This is a work of fiction inspired by real events. While Dean Paul Martin's tragic death in 1987 is a historical fact, the narrative about Dean Martin discovering additional information about the crash is a dramatized fictional account created for storytelling purposes.